Happy April Fool's Day! This year, I was part of a number of other podcasts that wanted to do some cross-promotion. So if you're looking for the story behind April Fool's Day, I invite you to check out the Forgotten News podcast, and the link is in the show notes for this episode. And welcome to Jim and Kate, the hosts of the Forgotten News podcast, who are doing this episode of The Story Behind. I should put a disclaimer on this that it may not be suitable for younger or sensitive audiences, since procreation and the anatomical names of body parts are mentioned. And remember, take everything you read or hear today with a grain of salt. Enjoy this episode of the Forgotten News podcast, and if you like it, be sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening to this as a Forgotten News podcast listener, thanks for coming over and checking out the story behind. Jim and Kate did a great job talking about the story behind this particular piece of Forgotten News, and I invite you to subscribe while you're over here. Without further ado, I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind Son of a Gun.
Welcome to the Forgotten News podcast. This is your window to hear true stories from long ago. Stories that once made headlines. Stories that people thought would be unforgettable. Yet those stories were soon lost in the sands of time, or were buried deep in the dustbin of history. In this podcast, we shake off the sand and dust from those stories and share them here with you, as fresh as the day they were first told.
And now, here's your hosts.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome to the Forgotten News podcast.
My name is Jim.
My name is Kate Karen, and I suppose you were expecting to hear an episode of the Story Behind podcast? Well, surprise! Nope. You will be hearing an episode of the Forgotten News podcast. Jim, are you sure this is okay with Emily? I mean, you checked with her, right?
Absolutely. 100%.
Emily is a super nice person. So I sure hope you aren't doing some weird hacking thing with her podcast.
No. You have nothing to worry about. Emily and I go way back as podcasters, and everything is totally okay.
Okay, Jim. I guess I'll just have to take your word for it.
Oh, well.
Anyway, here on the Forgotten News podcast, we are a little bit like the Story Behind podcast in that we talk about trivia and obscure facts, and very often the stories of footnote people from history.
And the people who never even made it into the footnotes.
And on this episode, you will learn about one such person. He might fit into both of those categories.
That's one way to look at it.
And guess what? For all of you fans of the story behind, we're going to tell you the story behind the phrase, son of a gun.
Yep, you'll learn the story behind in more ways than one.
However, we will give a short warning to listeners so you can decide for yourself as to whether you want to continue listening to this episode or not.
Okay.
Warning. On this episode, you will hear a mention of the American Civil War of the 1860s, as well as a battle and a couple of non-fatal bullet wounds, and the medical care of those wounds, along with a virgin birth. However, the specific details will be kept to the absolute minimum needed to tell the story in a historically accurate way. The Forgotten News podcast is not a show that indulges in gruesome or gory details or foul language in regard to any topic. But even so, if you think that hearing about these things could possibly cause you to have a negative emotional reaction, then this episode might not be something you should listen to. In addition, the story that is being featured is definitely not recommended for children. Parental discretion is strongly advised.
So, with all that having been said,
On with the show! Our story begins in 1874 with a medical journal, basically a magazine for doctors called the American Medical Weekly. Specifically, the issue dated November 7th, 1874. And in that issue, an article was published with the title,
"Attention gynecologists, notes from the diary of a field and hospital surgeon, CSA.
The author of the article was
Dr. L.G. Capers, M.D., Vicksburg, Mississippi."
Dr. Capers had served in the American Civil War as a member of the Confederate Army. His main job was to take care of soldiers who were injured while on active duty, but primarily on the battlefield. In the article, Dr. Capers told an extremely unusual medical case that had occurred during a battle that took place at the small community of Raymond, Mississippi. According to Dr. Capers, he was with his regiment as the fighting was occurring. A house stood about 300 yards behind the battlefield, and the residents of the house, a mother and her 2 daughters, were standing on their front porch, watching the battle and waiting to give help to any soldiers that were wounded. Suddenly, Dr. Capers noticed a soldier fall to the ground, and at almost the very same instant, he heard a scream from the house. He began giving medical treatment to the soldier who had been hit in the leg by a bullet. At this point, Dr. Capers observed that
the bullet had ricocheted and on its onward flight passed through the scrotum, carrying away the left testicle.
Then, while treating the wounds that had been suffered by the soldier, the mother from the house ran up to him and pleaded with him to examine her daughter, who she said had been hit by a stray bullet. The doctor complied and found that the eldest daughter had indeed received a bullet wound. In her case, the bullet had penetrated her lower abdomen and
the bullet was lost in the abdominal cavity, leaving a rugged wound behind.
The doctor only had time to prescribe the girl a painkiller before he was forced to retreat from the house with his regiment. However, 6 months later, he happened to be in the neighborhood of Raymond again and visited the girl. He found that her stomach had begun to swell. 3 months further on, she gave birth to an 8-pound son. Now, in view of the fact that this was 1863, the family of the girl was utterly embarrassed that their unmarried daughter had given birth to a child. The daughter, however, repeatedly insisted that she had never been intimate with any man or boy, and didn't know how this thing could have happened. Dr. Capers examined her and found that her hymen was intact, which typically means that a girl is a virgin. Nevertheless, despite the discovery, he personally disbelieved her claims, notwithstanding her insistence to the contrary. But 3 weeks later, The child's grandmother asked Dr. Capers to examine the boy. She told him that the boy's scrotum was dangerously enlarged and very sensitive. The doctor conducted an examination and immediately noticed that there was
something wrong about the genitals.
So he decided to operate, and when he did, he was astonished to find a bullet lodged inside the child. After much contemplation in regard to how a bullet could have become embedded within the child, Dr. Capers eventually realized the incredible series of events that must have happened. He remembered the young soldier who had been hit by a bullet that had passed through his left testicle. The same bullet, he determined, must have thereby acquired an amount of spermatoza, then continued onward and managed to impregnate the girl by penetrating into her uterus, finally resting in the abdomen of the young woman and later somehow working its way into the child's flesh at some point during the pregnancy. Dr. Capers then explained this wild chain of events to the family, and they requested to meet the soldier. The doctor set up a meeting after first informing the young man of his new and unexpected responsibility. The soldier was first struck with nervous fright when told the situation, but it was an unnecessary reaction because the meeting between the young man and the girl was a classic case of love at first sight. And they not only ended up marrying each other, but soon produced 2 more children by a more conventional technique. And listeners, the bizarre series of events is the origin of the phrase, son of a gun. Actually, no, it's not. April Fools, everybody. It's all a hoax. A joke from 1874 that got way out of control.
Dr. Capers had sent the story to the American Medical Weekly as a joke. He was trying to make fun of doctors who were telling all sorts of phony stories of miraculous successes with severely wounded soldiers on the battlefield during the American Civil War. He actually sent the article anonymously because he didn't want his name attached to it. But the editor recognized Dr. Capers' handwriting and decided to turn the tables on him by printing the story and listing Capers prominently as the author. However, after the story was published, it began to spread, although its origin and details became obscured. Yet, the basic outline was frequently repeated in all sorts of publications. First, starting with the British medical journal, The Lancet, which reprinted portions of the article the same year, 1874. Next, in 1896, the article was quoted in a reference book called Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine, and the story continued to spread in the years that followed. In 1959, it was again quoted in a medical journal, the New York State Journal of Medicine. The author of the 1959 article presented all the same details as the 1874 story, but as, quote, an authenticated case report, unquote. This 1959 author clearly read the original 1874 story, but evidently, somehow, did not get that it was a joke. In addition, as the years went on, the story was retold as truth in numerous non-medical publications, in particular during the 100th anniversary of the Civil War in the early 1960s. And even as late as the 1980s and 1990s, there were numerous respected sources, such as American Heritage Magazine, the Old Farmer's Almanac, and the Dear Abby advice column that told and retold the story as being true. Although over the decades, some details were mixed up by people who had never seen the original article. For example, very often, the soldier or the doctor were transformed into being members of the U.S. Army rather than the enemy Confederate Army. But the most crazy thing was that, with very rare exceptions, the fact that the original article was simply intended as a joke, a hoax, was almost unknown until the internet came along, together with numerous websites dedicated to investigating urban legends and rumors. So, in the present day, thankfully, you will find very few sources that report this story as being true.
And that is the end of our story. And all I can say is, wow, that was a pretty crazy story. It's incredible how such a ridiculous, totally wild fabrication was believed to be true and was then simply passed along by all sorts of respected and generally trustworthy sources.
I know. It's just astonishing. Totally incredible.
It's a perfect example of something that we have previously said more than once on this show. Fake news is the first draft of fake history.
The story of the miracle bullet is one of the most classic examples that there is.
And now, moving on, we would like to thank our guest voice for the role of Dr. Legrand Capers. So please take a bow and tell our listeners all about yourself.
Jeremy Collins of the Podcast We Listen To Facebook group and host of the podcast by the same name.
Now, listeners, I will say, if any of you are interested in true stories about, shall we say, related topics from the American Civil War, there are a couple of informative and often entertaining books that we will recommend. Sex and the Civil War by Judith Ginsburg and The Story the Soldiers Wouldn't Tell by Thomas P. Lowry, M.D. Those two books are relatively recent, so you might be able to find them through your local library or independent bookstore or an online source like Amazon or Barnes & Noble.
Okay.
Now, listeners, if this was a regular episode of the Forgotten News podcast, at this point, we would move on to a regular segment of the show called Police Blotter and Court News, in which we feature a few minutes of 100% true stories about small-time crooks and other unfortunate human beings from a century or more ago, who, for one reason or another, ended up hauled into a local criminal court.
Sometimes it's my favorite part of the show.
On this segment, you would hear how and why they got there and what happened to them. The stories range from hilarious to tragic, plus everything in between these bookends. But because for this special episode, we are here simply as guests of Emily and the Story Behind podcast, we don't want to overstay our welcome. So, if you'd like to hear our Police Blotter segment, you'll need to listen on our show, the Forgotten News podcast. either on our next episode or on a recent previous episode, since it is a segment that we only started a few months ago. Anyway, with that little clarification out of the way, I guess we should wrap up now. Right, Jim?
Yeah, I think so too.
Listeners, if you liked what you heard on this episode, well, we have 21 months of interesting stories and episodes for you to listen to. Although, I am only on the ones since December 2017, so definitely listen to those episodes first.
And on most episodes, you will hear guest voices, usually for quotes, but sometimes as a guest narrator. Oh, I guess I should mention the guest voices are generally other podcasters. For example, Emily from The Story Behind wants a guest voice.
You can follow the Forgotten News Podcast on Twitter and Facebook. Just use the search box and you'll find us. Our email is forgottennewspodcast@gmail.com, but type that as all one word.
We're always thrilled to hear from any listener.
And if you might possibly like to hear me, Kit Karen, tell stories of true crime and mystery, but in a very whispery voice, then please take a moment and check out my other podcast, Whispered True Stories. I'm pretty sure you can find it on almost every app and podcatcher, anywhere in the universe.
Hey, it's a great podcast with a stunningly smart, funny, and insightful host. Be sure to check it out. After you're done binging the Forgotten News Podcast, of course.
So hey, guess what? We're at the end of our episode. So, goodbye everyone.
Thanks for listening.
See you later. And remember, history is no mystery.
Thank you for listening to the Forgotten News Podcast. You will now be returned back to the present day, and we hope that we can count on you to join us for our next episode.
The great enemy of truth is very often not the lie. Deliberate, contrived, and dishonest. But the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic.
Thanks again for tuning in to what we podcasters have dubbed Operation Switcharoo. And thanks to Moxie from Your Brain on Facts for organizing this whole Operation Switcharoo. If you're a regular listener of The Story Behind and you're looking for your shout-outs about Trivia Tuesday posts in the Story Behind discussion group, head on over to the Forgotten News Podcast because that's where you'll find them. Have a great April Fool's Day, and thanks for listening.